Since Egyptologist James Hoffmeier favors the Ramesses Exodus date around 1250 BC, he looks for background information that fits the general history of Joseph in the centuries immediately preceding Ramesses. The idea that a foreigner could actually serve in Egypt, what is the likelihood of that?
Well, the idea of foreigners serving in Egypt, we have ample evidence for that in this Brooklyn papyrus. But what we're talking about in the case of Joseph is somebody who advances to a very high position, namely probably what would be considered the prime minister of Egypt. People often think that, well, this story of a rags to riches, this pit to the palace kind of story just doesn't happen in reality. Well, we do have a case. And the tomb of this man was only found in the mid to late 1980s at Saqqara, the necropolis just outside of Cairo. The French archaeologist Aling discovered a tomb, a series of tombs, covered over in sand. But one of the tombs was that of a man named Int'l. Int'l is not an Egyptian name, it's a Semitic name. And as it turns out, this man, Int'l, had become the prime minister of Egypt under the pharaoh Akhenaten. What's amazing is that he is a foreigner who advances to be the highest ranking official in Egypt in the 14th century BC. This is roughly the time of Moses. So the idea that a foreigner could advance to such a high position in Egypt is documented, it's attested. We didn't know about this until about 1986. So that's a relatively recent discovery, but it's a perfect fit for the sort of person Joseph was likely serving a similar capacity at an earlier time.
Charles Aling favors an early Exodus date around 1450 BC. He also accepts the standard chronology for Egypt, along with a 430-year stay in Egypt for the Israelites. This would put Joseph into the Middle Kingdom's 12th dynasty, but a few decades earlier than David Rowe would place him. He finds something very interesting about certain titles used in this era. Are there any other relationships that you think that show that there was Joseph or the character of Joseph in Egypt?
Well, I can think particularly of some of his titles. It's interesting to study titles of Egyptian officials, and this is what I did my doctoral work on. And so I know titles of Egyptian officials very, very well. And one of the things that seems to be said in Genesis 45, verse 8, in that verse, Joseph is talking to his brothers. He has revealed himself to his brothers, and he's having them at his home for a meal, and he tells them that in true Joseph-like fashion, that God is the one who caused all this, and they shouldn't be afraid, and so on. But then he starts talking about titles, and he mentions 3 in that verse, but 2 bear on what I want to say here. He was the second in command. He was the vizier, and he was chief steward of the king, the person who would be over the estates of the pharaoh. Mm-hmm. Now, when I first looked at that, I thought, this doesn't look possible. But you know, when you see something in the Bible that doesn't look possible, you just wait for further information. I've learned that a long time ago. And I looked at that and I said, how could that be? For instance, today, the President of the United States, if he's a governor of a state, he can't hold both. If he gets elected president, he retires as governor of his state.
So in the world that you knew of Egyptology, these 2 titles were never connected.
Never combined.
Okay.
Well, then an individual was discovered by the name of Khnum-Hotep. Now, Khnum-Hotep is a member of a famous Egyptian family. We know his parents, we know his brothers and sisters. He is definitely not Joseph. But this man, Khnum-Hotep, dates to the 1800s BC, the period in which I would date Joseph. If one accepts an early date for the Exodus and then goes back in the years of the sojourn of the Hebrews.
An early date meaning what?
Meaning 1400 BC for the time of the 1446 actually for the Exodus.
Okay.
So going back 430 years from that point, we come to the great Middle Kingdom period of Egyptian history. Now that's where Khnum-Hotep comes from. Now, his tomb is located right next to the tomb of his king. His king was the great Sesostris III, major king of the 12th Egyptian dynasty. Well, anyway, in that tomb of this official are his titles. Now, incidentally, when the French first excavated this, it was back in the 19th century, and any archaeologist was interested in his treasure to take back to the great museums of Europe. So they didn't even bother to look for inscriptions. And in fact, when the New York Metropolitan re-cleared this tomb fairly recently, they found over 100 historical inscriptions in the French garbage heap.
Oh,
French didn't even look at them. And what they show us is that this man, Khnumhotep, was vizier of Egypt and chief steward of the king, just like Joseph in the book of Genesis.
So basically, do you think that this understanding, which wasn't clear before, that you could hold these two titles, was there any connection to Joseph making that a possibility?
I would think so. And of course, it's supposition on my part, but my theory would be this. My reconstruction would be that Khnumhotep was perhaps the successor of Joseph, that King Sesostris made Joseph the vizier and chief steward to handle the unique problems of the famine and all of that. And then Joseph did so well that the Pharaoh said, let's try it with the next guy, after Joseph retired, and gave the same titles to this man. I think it's too much of a coincidence to look at the only two examples of this in all of Egyptian history being right together at this time period. So I think Joseph held both of those posts in the Egyptian government.